Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. I am your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Josh Bertram, is out today. But today I am so honored to be talking to Mr. or Doctor, I should say, John Fortier. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI, where he focuses on Congress and elections, election administration, demographics, voting, the U.S. presidency, and all the things that pertain to elections. And I just found out he has his own podcast, which is called, you say the voting booth?
The voting booth, yes.
The voting booth. And yeah, we're just so happy to have him here. So, hey, welcome to the show, John.
Good. Thanks for having me, Will.
Okay, so before we begin, I do have to ask, like, how does one get into the business of studying elections and work for AI?
Well, I think there are a couple parts to that story. I mean, I'm a political scientist by training and had studied some elections. One thing I will say, though, is for people maybe more my age, the 2000 election, the Bush v. Gore election, was a big eye-opener for a lot of law professors, political scientists, partly because we hadn't really thought of all of the mechanics of elections and studied that. And so a lot of us got very into that. I also had some interest in the Electoral College. That also was an important feature of that election. So I would say there was some background and interest, but with the 2000 election, and I was sitting at AEI at the time, got very interested in the mechanics of the Electoral College as well as the mechanics of sort of how we vote in a day-to-day way in a general election.
That's pretty awesome. So, um, the reason I wanted to have you on, I heard you interviewed on another wonderful AI podcast called Understanding Congress. Excuse me, and um, it was totally fascinating. After it was all done, I had like 1,000 more questions, of which I had to narrow down to like 10 or 15 for this interview. Um, and and I wanted to just sort of have like a what if episode. So I'm a big Marvel fan. Fans of the show know I talk about Marvel like all the time. But I want to do sort of a what if episode of like, what are all the different permutations that could happen in this year's election? It always seems like every year that's like this is the most important election in our lifetime. Um, I don't know if that's the case this year, but I definitely think this year offers more variables than other elections in my own lifetime. So I'd love just for one for you just kind of comment on whether or not my assessment of this year's elections does pose some interesting and unique circumstances that other elections haven't.
Well, I'm always a little reluctant to say this is the most important election because we tend to say that almost every election,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
we've had a lot of closely contested elections, and now we have the same two candidates we had last time. And of course, we did have with January 6th, and that's leaving aside the violence there,
Mhm.
just questions about the mechanisms of the Electoral College, people more knowledgeable about the way things work going forward, and a good chance of a pretty close election, which again, if you think back to the 2000 election or others, any close election and the way we resolve it is something that's, it's a tough thing for a democracy to do that. And so thinking about the ways in which we do it is important.
So in a normal, I don't know if that even works. And assuming there are no hiccups, how does one generally get elected to become president?
Yes, I think in a normal election, most people don't even think about the mechanics behind the elections. But let's just lay out a normal election and what's going on. So first, of course, we have the people going to the polls and voting in the November election, and that's true for a presidential election as well as for Senate and House. But in the presidential election, people think they're voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden, but really they're voting for these presidential electors. And they're a bit mysterious, but basically each state has a certain number based more or less on population. You get two for being a state, and then the number of reps you have. So the smallest states have three. Largest state, California, I believe, has 54 at this point. But you have these electors who, in most states, you don't even see them on the ballot. A few states you may see the name Joe Biden, and then you'll see these little names underneath it, and the same thing for Donald Trump. They're the people who are actually going to cast some ballots for president later in December. And so the results of that November election, when you go to the polls, are very important, and each state resolves their election process. If it's close, they might have a recount, or they might have some contest provision in the courts, but they resolve it, and then they say, Donald Trump won. So these three electors from our state, these are the real electors. We're sending the names to Washington, and those three electors will come back, and the electors from all the states across the country will come back not in one place. They'll come back to their state capitals, and separately in these groups, uh, cast their ballots for president and for vice president. And those ballots will then go to Congress. And before 2020, really, people didn't know much about January 6th, but January 6th now is the day that those ballots, the electors' ballots, which have been cast in mid-December, are opened up by the Congress and usually just simply counted, getting to a certain number. And if you get 270 of our 538 electors, a majority, then you're elected president, and the same for vice president. And then on January 20th, the inauguration day at noon, the new president-elect and vice president-elect are sworn in as president and vice president for a 4-year term. So that's how it's supposed to work. But of course, all of these parts of the process, in theory, something could happen in the voting process, in the vote casting process, in the counting process, and even sometimes if we don't get a majority, some sort of secondary processes that are going on behind the scenes.
Got it. So the 270 number is, has that always been 270? Will it go up or go down based on the population or anything like that?
No, it's not always been 270. So the way it's calculated is, so each state gets, it's basically the number of senators and representatives that are out
Yeah.
there,
Hmm.
plus the District of Columbia. So there are 100 senators, or each state has two senators. So each state would get two electors for their senators. And today we have 435 members of Congress. That's not always been the case. We've increased the size of Congress over the time. We haven't for the last 100 years or so, but still that number could change. So that gets up to 535, and then we have a special amendment to the Constitution that allows D.C. to vote in the presidential election as if it were a state. It's a smaller state, so they would have two senators. They don't, but the two plus one, they look like one of the small states, and that gets us to 538.
Got it. Okay. So although unlikely, um, the 270 could, in theory, years down the road, increase to like, I don't know, just be in relation with the population of the United States, right?
Absolutely. The two most obvious ways it would happen would be we would either add a state. If you added a state, you're certainly gonna add two senators and at least one representative, depending on the
Mhm.
size of that state. Or we could just by law, it's not a constitutional amendment, change the size of the House, increase the size. And we did that all throughout our history from the beginning up until the early part of the 20th century when we finally said, well, we're kind of at a good stopping point. And then we added Alaska and Hawaii a little bit later, got a little bit further, but pretty much have decided not to change that size of the House of Representatives, which could also change that number.
Got it. So with this election, obviously the two main candidates, although the convention hasn't happened yet, but President Biden and Trump are sort of the two main ones. But there are a lot of other third party candidates. RFK Jr. is one of them. Some other ones that don't really get a lot of airtime, but they're out there. So if RFK, and he is on the ballot, near as I can tell, at a majority of the states within the country. I can't remember what the last count was, but if he wins or not wins, if he gets some of the electors for certain states, um, a presidential elect wouldn't get to 70. Like then what happens?
Yes, you're looking at the possibility of what some people call the contingent election, a sort of an election if we don't get a majority. And you're right. There are two ways you could get to this. One would be there'd be a third party candidate. That's still very difficult uh, because we had, if you remember back in 1992, especially Ross Perot
Hmm.
had a very strong showing as a third party candidate, got nearly 20% of the popular vote, votes all over the states, but he didn't win a single state. And so therefore he didn't get any electors. And we haven't talked about it yet, but the states do have some flexibility in how they assign the electors, but all the states but two, it's winner take all. If you win your state by just a few votes and you're the winner, you get all of the electors from that state, not proportionally. Maine and Nebraska have a slightly different system by district, but it's hard for a candidate today, I think, to win. We had a time not too far before that in 1948 and 1968 where we had a couple of Dixiecrat candidates running, Strom Thurmond and George Wallace, and they didn't get as much of the popular vote as Ross Perot, but their vote was very concentrated. They won some southern states, and so they actually did get electors. So it is possible, you're right, to be denied the 270 votes because there are three or more candidates out there who get electors and nobody gets to 270. I think today it's a little less likely than when we were worried about sectional differences, where part of the country would actually vote. There would be somebody who would win a state in a part of the country rather than just do very well. The other possibility, which seems a little remote, we did have this once in a sort of odd situation in the 1800 election, a slightly different version of the Electoral College, but could happen today, is that we have 269 to 269. And that way there is no 270 either. So with all those complications, you could get to a point where everything is successful. We count the votes. We don't have controversy. We cast the votes, the electoral votes. January 6th, Congress counts the votes, and yet nobody has that 270. And then the Constitution says, and this has been changed a bit, the more current part is in the 12th Amendment, that you're going to take a different kind of election for president. You're going to go to the House of Representatives, but you're going to vote by state. So even though the House of Representatives has 435 members and many more members from California than from Rhode Island, you are going to vote each state having one vote. And you need a majority of the states, 26 states, not a majority, not a plurality, not a majority of those who vote. You need 26 states to actually vote for somebody for president. And, that probably should happen. And I think the current numbers are slightly, Republicans are at 26 or 27. I'd have to look at it. But it could happen that maybe you don't even get to the 26 because there could be some delegations that are split. A delegation that has two representatives, one Republican, one Democrat. If they don't agree, that vote does not get cast for either Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. So hopefully the way it gets resolved is the House of Representatives, by this strange way of voting by state delegation, gets to 26 states voting for someone. And we did have that in the 1824 election. And then the Senate actually, the vice presidency is different. It actually goes to the Senate, with the Senate voting more or less like it does by senator, although still needing 51 senators to get somebody there. Possibly we don't resolve that election, as I mentioned, in the House, but that is the way that the first round of ways to resolve that type of election.
Yeah. So in the House, I want to just kind of focus on that for a second, just so I understand it. So we'll take California. Maybe there's, I don't know, 54 people in their delegation. Like is that conducted like on the floor on January 6th? Does that take place the next day? And then is it like a majority vote? So if everybody raises their hand and says, "Yep, I want this candidate," then that's the winner of that state.
Well, it does happen immediately. That's what says the Constitution, that if you count the vote, you get to the final count of those votes, it immediately, and you don't have 270, you're going to go to the House of Representatives, and they're going to meet. There is a little bit of uncertainty exactly how these states vote. I mean, it's a simple point. If a majority of the delegation votes one way, then the state is going to be that way. So if it's four representatives and three of them vote one way and one votes the other, it's going to go that way. There is some question of what happens if it was split three ways and there's a plurality.
Yeah.
And we've had some different rules, proposals for House rules and what to do about that. But leaving that aside, it happens pretty quickly. It's done by the majority. But a problem is, of course, if everybody followed their party, and they don't have to, right? There's no rule they have to, but in our current era, much more likely that it's likely to have a split vote, one Republican, one Democratic rep from a state. That vote's really not going to count to the total. So, and there aren't so many of those states today. I think we've got a couple and it's likely to change with this election. But it is possible again that nobody gets to the 26. But that's the goal, to get 26, and then you've got a president.
Got it. And just to be clear, like they can only vote for the two candidates that had, 269, 269. They couldn't, decide to, I don't know, vote for some random person that wasn't even on the ballot.
Uh, Basically, yes. Technically, they could vote for the top three people who get electors.
Got it.
And that was actually a change they made in the 12th Amendment, and oddly enough, 1824, we had an election with four candidates, and only three of them got to count. So in theory, you get a complicated election. They can vote for the top three. The Senate later on for the vice president, they can only vote for the top two. But your point is right, that they cannot just go find someone else who didn't get electoral votes. This is an election about people who actually received electoral votes. The people voted, the electors were elected. Those electors in December voted for these people, and this election, this contingent election, if we don't get a majority, is between the top three vote getters of electors. And that's why uh, Ross Perot wouldn't be in that contingent election if there were a one back in 1992, because he didn't win any states, he didn't get any electors.
Mm.
But someone like George Wallace or Strom Thurmond earlier in 48 and 68 would have been in that, would have been able to be voted for in that group of people that the House could consider.
So in theory, like RFK Jr. could be president, right? Like, I mean, highly unlikely, but assuming that he's sort of the third tier or the third person that got votes and everything, the House went to their corners and voted for him. Like he could become president.
Well, I mean, I do think it's a bigger hurdle for him to win an elector
Mm,
than you think, right?
mm,
And again, Ross Perot got
yeah,
20% of the vote nationally, didn't
yeah.
get any electors. So it's not just third place in the popular vote. Oh, he did really well. It is actually third place in people who win electors, which means basically people who win a state, win a at least a plurality of the state in this election. And so he's going to have to go out and win a state essentially if he wants to be considered in some obscure contingent election, which could happen, but not just do very well in third place, but not win any electors.
Got it. So over in the Senate, you said the Senate votes for the vice president. Can you kind of walk through like one, do they have to? Because like in the voting booth, people aren't voting for the vice president. So like, do the same rules apply for who they're voting for?
Well, you are voting for the vice president in the voting booth. It'll be listed in the voting booth, but interestingly enough, it's really the same. You're voting for the same group of electors. You aren't
Mm,
voting for separate electors for president and vice president. You're
I
voting for
gotcha. Mm,
these electors. They cast two votes in December. They'll write one ballot. Here's my vote for president, and
mm,
here's my vote for vice president. The January 6th, they'll count this. But we actually have had the last contingent election we had was not a presidential one. It was 1836, I believe. The vice president at the time, William Richard Mentor Johnson, did not get a majority. Some state decided not to vote for him for vice president, and so he didn't get the majority. But then the Senate elected him that way. It's more like the regular Senate than this House vote that we were talking about, because every senator gets one vote. There's a slightly higher quorum requirement, and then you do need a majority. You need 51, not just a plurality. So assume, and you can only pick from the top two. So Nicole Shanahan is, if she's the third place and they win, she's out. She's not going to be the vice president.
right.
But this is a separate election than the vice president. I mean, in theory, you could end up getting the majority in the presidency and vice presidency. Probably they're going to go together, but they could be separate like they were in 1836. And the Senate, as long as 51 senators vote for someone for president or for vice president, they are the ones who are going to be the vice president. Now, if for some reason we didn't elect the president in the House, we didn't get the 26 states, we're still waiting. We don't have anybody, and you elect a vice president. Well, that person could be president, right? That person's gonna on January 20th assume the presidency.
Interesting.
But if everything goes more according to plan, they're elected as vice president.
I mean, that's actually a really, I've never thought about that. So there is a timing dynamic. So I mean, if the pass is any, I don't know, like indication of how well each, house sort of behaves, I mean, ostensibly you would think the Senate would have it together before the House would. So, there could be a, President Kamala Harris and President whoever, Trump's running mate is like, but it would only be for a short period, right? Until like the House.
Well, I mean, the person does not become president upon that election on January 6th. They still have to wait till the term ends on
Hmm.
January 20th. So I think this would all be resolved by then. But if in theory, you're right, that the House was somehow divided in a way, couldn't get its act together, couldn't get to the 26 states, and that could happen just because the not that Republicans couldn't all vote together, but because there are some split delegations, and Republicans only have 25 states, so they don't have the other one. Um, I mean, this is a little complicated, but in theory, yes, they could later come back even in the term and then put this person in and then have the president. But for the most part, I think we expect that we're either going to get that 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 we'll probably have that resolved, and if not, then the vice president will be the president. But there is a possible timing issue where the presidency isn't decided right away. One interesting point: it didn't happen exactly this way, but in 1800, one of our most controversial elections, the Electoral College looked a little different then. But we had the problem was we didn't really specify whether the votes were for president or vice president. You just voted for the top two, and the second place person became vice president. So Jefferson and Aaron Burr were running together, and it was assumed that Aaron Burr would be the vice president, but all of the Democratic Republican electors of his party voted for both of the candidates. They ended up in a tie, and they couldn't really resolve it without the help of the other party, the Federalists. So there was this long period of negotiations where Alexander Hamilton eventually kind of came to the rescue of Jefferson, ironically, because they weren't great friends, but he distrusted Burr even more. And so you did have a period of time where there was some negotiation where they couldn't get someone to have a majority of the House delegations that they needed to elect somebody in this very strange tie situation. We changed a little bit with the 12th Amendment after that. We said, oh, you got to say how you vote for president and vice president, make them separate so you would never have the president and vice president tying with each other. But you could have a tie of another sort, like we have today, and maybe, maybe Democrats have enough votes to keep it from happening, or there might be some negotiation, there might be some extended period of time that this takes place over.
And just one last question on the Senate part. They can't filibuster, right?
It's a little unclear, and uh, you know, I think that I don't want to say this. Uh, uh, people who know very deep Senate procedure probably would know better, but I think there is often in the background the possibility of the Senate doing something that goes back to moving to a more majority vote process. They have done so, for example, on judicial nominations and other nominations. So I suspect if really it was a party thing and somebody were trying to filibuster it, that majority probably could find a way to overcome it. But it might be subject to a filibuster, at least initially. But I would have to go back and look at the precedents on that.
Interesting. So Congress members are sworn in though before January 20th. I can't remember what the date was.
January 3rd, yes.
January 3rd. Yeah. So how does that factor in, if at all? I'm assuming it probably doesn't because now they're the new, whatever 119th Congress, so they're the ones that would be in the seat. Does that sound right?
Yes, I mean, but it's an interesting historical question because we've changed that over time. The 20th Amendment we passed, which changed the dates which the presidency and Congress started. It used to be that they both started on March 4th, so you
Mhm.
had a longer period of time between November election and that. And what that meant was that the lame duck Congress, the one that was going out, had maybe been voted out already, was the one who was going to do the counting of the votes on, it wasn't January 6th then, but a different date like that. And ultimately would do this contingent election if that were the case. And so, that was not ideal, right? You could have a overwhelming loss of one party in power, and then the Congress, which is of that party, gets to do all the counting and deciding of things. So the 20th Amendment makes January 3rd the date the new Congress comes in, and January 20th the day the new president is sworn in. And that means that I mean, January 6th is a day set by law, could be moved technically, but as of now, January 6th occurs during that new Congress. So you elect these new people, you swear them in, you elect a speaker. I know we've had some issues with that recently, but you get your people in place, and then shortly thereafter, one of the first things really that that new Congress does in every 4 years is to then have that counting joint session where the votes are counted for the electoral votes are counted for the president to actually certify or say who the president and vice president are.
Mm. Now, this, January 6th, obviously, you mentioned earlier, is a date that all of America has become familiar with. On that day, I remember there was some dispute about the electors and sending them back. Can you sort of like walk through what that process is all about, and if that could be another sort of scenario, that could sort of come up the works.
Yes, I mean, so it's a complicated thing. First, I think one premise of the Electoral College, the way it was set up, is that the states do have a lot of leeway into setting up how they figure out how they're going to elect their electors. And that meant even in many cases in the early part of our republic that sometimes they didn't have elections. They appointed them directly. South Carolina did that all the way up to the Civil War, and a couple states even after the Civil War for sort of timing purposes when they came into the Union. Um, but they now all have electoral codes, and they resolve their elections, and they send their electors to their state capitals. They vote, and then those votes get sent to Washington. Now there are some possibilities for objection, and there are some laws that govern this. It's a little tricky, but I think just to think about, aside from the legal and constitutional, the proper kinds of objections, I think, which would fit with our electoral college are ones about the electors themselves. So some of the early objections back in the early 19th century were, well, this state just joined the union. Did it join in time? Does it count?
Mhm.
Or there was a state that wasn't able to have their electors meet on the day they were supposed to meet because there was a snowstorm and they met the day after. Are they allowed to do this? And not the thing that I think was not envisioned that Congress would do would be to go and look at the election results in the states. Oh, Texas had a bad election. It was illegitimate. We're not going to count these electors. But it wasn't 100% clear, and where we really started having problems, and again, we had some tough elections recently, but the one that I think it was the worst of all was 1876. After the Civil War, we are coming back into somewhat of normalcy in that many southern states are coming back into the union, but there's almost two governments in some of these states. There's a government that under Reconstruction protecting the rights of African Americans to vote and electing sometimes African Americans or Republicans in the South, and then there are people coming saying, well, no, these are the actual legislature and the Congress. And so we had a very, very contentious 1876 election where in several states there were two sets of electors sent to Washington. Now, that shouldn't really happen, right? You should only send one set of people to vote,
Mhm.
because you won the election, you're the right electors, you get to vote. But in this election, we had that, and it became a very, very controversial issue. The House and Senate were in different hands, one Republican, one Democrat.
Mhm.
They had to their version of January 6th, which was on a different date, they couldn't agree which ones to count. No, and so they set up a commission. They almost couldn't agree again, and they went almost up to Inauguration Day, which was in March, without having a president. So that's kind of the nightmare scenario where you really could, as I say, I don't think you should have two sets of electors, but we did have them sometimes,
Mhm.
and they've come up, and that's where people start to think, well, we had this set of electors because they were the legitimate elected ones, maybe the ones by the right electoral people. Now we passed a law after that called the Electoral College Act 10 years later or so, and for the most part we kind of calmed down these objections. We didn't really have any. We had one in 1968, which was about kind of about faithless electors, not a big topic. And then in the early 2000s, we definitely had some people starting to object, Democrats in this case, to a few states saying, oh, we don't believe the electors in certain states in 2000, 2004. people will remember now the big question is that you need to have both support of the Senate and the House, at least one member at the time, to consider the objection. We
Mm.
did have that in 2004. We didn't do it, but we considered it. We did a little in 2016, and then a much bigger push on the Republicans to for several states, and they were even talked about some more, where there were some efforts to get a second set of electors. As I said, I don't think it's ever legitimate to have a second set of electors,
Mhm.
but we've had some odd cases out there in the past. I mean, another one in 1960, which was a precedent that I think some people used, but maybe tried to really stretch and wasn't appropriate. Was
Mhm.
we'd had an election, and then we were having a recount, went way past the day they were supposed to go, and then
Mhm.
another set of electors ended up being the ones appointed. So you had these two sets.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I think this is a sort of dangerous territory to be in. I'm not sure a court really is going to step in and do anything about it, but um, we have passed a new law trying to clarify the ways in which some of these objections happen. I think the obvious things are it's made it much harder to object. You need more reps and more senators. It's clarified that the vice president isn't the one making these decisions. That was a controversy. I think that's true in the Constitution anyway, but the law kind of just makes it more clear. And then there's some other much more complicated things about when they can object. And I think it's good that they're there. I guess I'm not 100% sure that they'll be, you know, imposed by a court on people. So there's this kind of set of mechanisms, if kind of used I think, added up together in sort of an inappropriate way, but one that does play on the fact that states have power to do things, that the Congress has some power in the counting of the votes, that were leading us to potentially some problems. And just we talked about the contingent election before. Nobody gets a majority. One thing that I think that's a little different is in 1876 we didn't get to the count, or we didn't finish the count because people were arguing is
Mhm.
is Louisiana, is it this slate of electors or is it that slate of electors? And the law tries to make people decide, but if
Mhm.
they really can't decide, then at the end of the day, you just don't finish the count. And that's different than the contingent election. You don't go to
Mhm.
the House after that. You just don't have an answer. And you could just be sitting there for day after day until now, in our case, January 20th, where you had nobody elected. And January 20th, it really came to that. You'd go to the Presidential Succession Act. You'd go to
Mhm.
the House of Representatives. The Speaker of the House of Representatives would become the president. And so the point is that there are different things that could go wrong. One would be a tie, nobody gets the majority. One is you just have all these disputes, so somehow you can't finish that count and you can't get a
Mhm.
number, and therefore you still don't have a president, and you get to some other things. So I think we've probably done enough in our law and people thinking about it that we won't have those issues. But I can't swear to it. I can't guarantee that you couldn't have those issues in the future. But I think just people should think about it as we should probably have one slate of electors. There shouldn't be a good reason for having a second slate.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but I'd love for you to maybe dig a little bit deeper. Like, how does one actually become an elector? Like, I've heard different versions, and maybe it's because it's done differently in each state. But can you explain that?
Yeah, like everything in America, everything's done differently in every state. So, but similar idea. Basically, these are people who are picked as loyal party people and broadly loyal to the candidate. So sometimes it's done by state convention or some nominating process. The candidates often do get some control or some influence in their state parties, but the idea is at the end of the day, the people, the little names who are listed in the few states that list them below Donald Trump are people who are really loyal to vote for Donald Trump. And similarly, for Joe Biden, we also have some different state rules about. I mentioned almost every state is winner take all, so you get all the
Mhm.
electors except for Maine and Nebraska, which has a district system. But there are some different laws about how strictly we mean that. So some states say, yeah, well, you should vote for them. Some states say you should be pledged for them. A few states say you vote the right way or you'll get $100 fine, $500 fine. There are a few states now that have these very strong protections that say you'll be replaced and you won't be allowed to vote the wrong way. And the court has actually upheld that. So that's interesting. But we have a loyal party people in both parties being the electors. So therefore not so likely to vote in a way we wouldn't expect, but not impossible. We've had people over the years who voted not as they were so-called faithless electors who vote usually as a protest vote in an election that doesn't matter, just to say something rather than to affect the outcome. But in theory, a very close election, a faithless elector could affect the presidential outcome.
Mm. Like any nepotism laws about who can be an elector? And the thing that made me think about it, because I saw an article recently about Barron Trump potentially, to be a delegate or something like that in Florida or something, and Melania came out with a statement saying, "Now that's not going to happen." But it made me think like is it possible that a family member would have to vote against, I don't know, their dad, their wife, their husband, whatever?
Yeah, there are no nepotism laws. There is in the Constitution that you cannot be a federal office holder. So you can't have members of Congress or Senate or cabinet officers be electors. And occasionally states have forgotten that. They've had to replace, oh, we've forgotten we had to replace them with an alternate because we didn't really read the Constitution well enough. Um, there's no nepotism law. You could go and in fact early in the Republic there were many. I'd say the electors were probably a little more prominent than they are today. Today nobody's ever heard of them. They are people who are loyal to their state political parties involved, but they're often not very famous people. They could be state officials, and occasionally somebody you'd heard of, but not generally.
So what role does the court play in settling, these types of disputes?
Well, I mean, I think some people give a little different answer to that, and the court played a role in the 2000 election, so that's not so far in our back in our history. I think the way to think about it is the court is likely to play a role primarily related to the way in which the people vote in the November election, and that of course is very significant. And you could have a challenge to the, the state laws that in advance that should we have voter ID or should we have this kind of registration law? Is it unconstitutional? Um, the recounts, obviously, in the Florida case, both state and then federal courts got involved. And there are people who think the Supreme Court shouldn't have gotten involved, and I think there's an argument to be made for that one way or the other. But I also think that they still were, even though they were late in the process, they still were dealing with the votes being cast by the voters. Where I think they're probably not going to get involved, and others would push back, would be somehow in telling Congress this is the way you count the electoral votes. I know we have an electoral now count reform act, and we had an electoral count act before, kind of give some guidelines or ways in which Congress should do things. I also think that Congress really is the ultimate vote counter for that. So I don't think the court would get involved with that. And I guess one other interesting point for your listeners is that in congressional elections, Congress actually has the final say, and not the courts, which people don't realize because it doesn't happen that often. But if you have a House of Representatives race, you may have a court very involved in the way in which the votes are counted and what the final vote count is coming out of a district or a state. And then it still goes to when Congress meets and is going to swear in its members and might have a disputed election. They might say, look, we're not sure who won that election. We're going to take a look. We could even take a look at the ballots. And I think that's different than the presidential election where the Congress really shouldn't be looking at the ballots that were cast. They might look at the electors. But the Congress has the power at the very end of the day to resolve those elections. And less frequently today, we sometimes see a Congress say, no, that wasn't the right result, or we'll maybe go back and do the election again. Um, Less power in the presidential election, but they have some aspects of that power. And I think courts are not the final say when you're talking about both the presidential and the congressional elections when they are going to be put into power by the last certification of those electors.
All right. So I guess, well, what are what are some other permutations that could occur that maybe I didn't pose in my questions, or I mean, as a person that looks at this stuff kind of with the Goodwill Hunting sort of like meme with the like formulas floating above your head and whatnot. Like, what are some other ways a person can become president?
Well, I hate to dive into this rabbit hole, but you're inviting me to. So there you know, it's a complicated period between the November election and January 20th, and it has several parts to it, right? So the first part is, you know, resolving that election, counting those votes. Then the electors are going to vote. Then they're going to get counted, and then you're going to swear in the president. And one of the most difficult scenarios, and we've been thinking about this partly because of some other work we're doing, is on the question of, well, what happens if one of the candidates or both of the candidates dies just before the election, just after the election, just after the electors vote. And I'm not sure I'm going to walk you through the entire scenario, but it gets very complicated because, again, if the candidates died maybe just after the election, interestingly, the electors have still been elected. Those people, the little names, have been elected, and they could go ahead and vote for their vice president, their Democratic or Republican presidential candidates as they were supposed to, but maybe they vote for somebody else, and it's a little complicated because of state laws. But that's a possibility, but very fuzzy. What if the electors have voted very clearly for someone? They're 400 electoral votes for one person, 135 for the other. But then a terrorist attack happens, and both of them are killed. What's Congress going to do when it gets those electoral votes for the people who are no longer alive? Are they going to count them? They're not going to count them. And we've had some different precedents on both sides. I mean, again, just usually minor things. Somebody like a vice president died who was a losing candidate, and what to do about it, but we don't really know. A little more clear it happens, of course, if after January 6th counts, partly because we have the Presidential Succession Act, but without scaring people too much, I do think that's an area we could try to clarify a little bit more what happens if some of these things happen. And I don't really want to mean just because we have two very old presidents. I think we started thinking about this in the context of more of a continuity of government 9/11 type things. But it is a set of issues that it needs some addressing.
Oh my gosh, that's frightening. to, I mean, if we think the country's divided now, geez, wow. Okay, so last question on this topic, the convention, so the Democratic Convention, Republican Convention, there was a lot of talk, at least in my liberal circles, about Biden should just declare a person at the convention. Like, does that change the calculus at all about the election, given that Biden's name is, I don't know if it would still be on the ballot or not, but like how would that work?
Yes, I get asked about this a lot. So I mean, I was talking just now about what happens if something happens right after election day and all those. But of course, any day from now on, what if something really changed? So the conventions are important. Right now, we know what's going to happen. It's going to be a rubber stamp, and Joe Biden's going to get elected, and Donald Trump, and their vice presidential candidates, whoever that is on the Republican side. But that if for some reason Joe Biden stepped aside and said he didn't want to run, well, now it's a different situation than it would have been earlier. Nobody else can run. There are already a majority of electors committed to Joe Biden, and more coming in. So we would likely go back to what we did in conventions early on. That the convention used to be the place where things were decided. We didn't have primaries, or for part of our history, we had some primaries and some states that didn't have them. But there was a negotiation among the congressional delegates, the delegates at the conventions, and since the first vote, they would be committed to Biden, that would go past, and then they would have to find somebody else. It wouldn't have to be Kamala Harris. I think there might be some pressure to make her the president, and then to pick someone else. So that could happen, and it wouldn't affect. I mean, for the ballots that were printed in the fall, they could be printed with the new people on it. But Joe Biden couldn't just say who the new person would be, but of course he might, if he's stepping aside, might have a real strong opinion that would affect people's idea of what to do. You could also have the case after the conventions are already picked their people and something happens. And we did have that in 1972 with our Democratic vice presidential nominee had to step aside, and the convention had to come back, or the convention itself didn't come back, but the committee of the DNC essentially came back and had to put a new vice presidential candidate on the 1972 ticket, Sergeant Shriver. And so that person went forward, and that was early enough to get on the ballots. Then people ask, well, maybe what if something happened in the fall? And
Mhm.
could you get on the ballot? Probably not once you're in a certain point because the ballots have been printed. They've been sent out to overseas voters 45 days before the election. But again, in a weird way, with our Electoral College vote, the electors are still the same. Those people are actually going to vote in December. They're loyal Democrats. But again, you'd have to make sure that they all vote for the Democratic Party kind of picks new people or a new person and gets those electors in December to vote the right way. And again, there are some state laws which make it a little trickier. So it's a messy situation, but there are theoretically ways in which things could happen down the road. But as for changing and getting the right names on the ballot that would stay on the ballot, you'd probably need to do that. I mean, there's an August convention, so it would have to happen pretty quickly after for Democrats to have that happen. But the main answer to your question is we used to have these conventions where the delegates had to figure out who was going to be the president, and we would have that again because there were those delegates bound to Biden wouldn't be voting for Biden, and we kind of have negotiation among the delegates as to who would be the next presidential and vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, I just a few more last questions that kind of touch on some of your other professional experiences. If I recall, you spent some time with the Commission on Presidential Debates, and given the recent news about there's now two debates in the book, I think two. They're sort of sidestepping the commission. So maybe can you explain, like, number one, like what is the Commission on Presidential Debates, and is it significant that the two candidates are sort of bypassing them?
Yeah, so I had a more formal role on the President's Commission on Election Administration, which is a little different, but that's to sort of reform the way we vote. But I do have interacted some with the Commission on Presidential Debates. I think the commission is actually, has performed a very good service for many years, and people sometimes think of it as a very official organization. It's not. It essentially was put in because we didn't have regular debates, and there was not always the incentive, especially for the incumbent president, to debate. You might think, I'm ahead, I'm an incumbent, why am I going to debate this person? Or if they did do debates, they would have to just agree with the other candidate as to all the details, and that might mean you get one or two debates. But this commission came into place with the idea that they would have, at the time, that the recent head of the Republican National Committee, recent head of the Democratic National Committee, and some other Republicans and Democrats who would be a more formal but private nonprofit organization that would be trusted by both parties. And they would be able to relay the concerns of their candidates and on all this, but ultimately, because they were trusted, they became able to set up what was three presidential debates and one vice presidential debate, and that worked well for 40 years or so, and there were some rumblings, I think, even before this very recent change. On the Republican side, of worries about the convention, about the debate commission, and I guess I'll say it probably the two biggest things that Republicans complained about, and they said they weren't actually going to participate. Ronna McDaniel, the RNC chair, had pulled out. Um, was that, well, maybe the people on the debate commission aren't quite really as close to the party as they were. They're more older Republicans and people who probably aren't Donald Trump supporters, maybe not in the middle of the party today. And then secondly, they always worried about the moderator. And from the Republicans' perspective, they think most mainstream media moderators are probably not Republican. And maybe they sometimes pointed back to Candy Crowley with Mitt Romney and said, you know, when push comes to shove, something's going to come up and they're going to be against us. And so they were worried about the commission. Now, Joe Biden was actually a little unhappy with the commission in 2020 as well. He complained because Donald Trump, it looks like he might have had COVID during the debate.
Hmm.
And of course, we had huge differences between the parties about what was appropriate and what
Sure.
was appropriate in COVID and what to do and what sort of guests. But broadly speaking, we weren't sure we were going to have debates because Republicans were going to pull out. But then Donald Trump has been on his own saying, hey, look, Joe Biden won't debate me. Well, Joe Biden comes out very suddenly, says, I challenge you here, have a couple debates, here are the conditions. And I guess my reading of it is that Donald Trump, while he might not have liked all of the conditions of this, he said, sure, let's do it. And so they're doing the two debates, and they're not doing it with the debate commission. They're doing it on their own with the networks. Trump is pushing for a couple more. I think the idea of a debate commission was a good one. I do think that they probably were going to have to address this idea of being a little closer to the parties,
Mm.
because ultimately the Trump and Biden people had to negotiate this or agree to it, and that's what you have to really have a debate.
Mm.
Now you can remove yourself from that a little bit by saying, okay, well we have these trusted people; they can set it up in advance, and that's all good. But if you get too far away from the current parties, I think then it doesn't become a great agreement. And so, if there is the debate commission itself or some other new entity that comes about in the future for regularizing the debates that are closer to the parties, I think that would be great. But for this time, we're going to have at least two debates, and maybe a couple more if Donald Trump gets what he's asking for.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I've learned so much. I'm definitely going to be tuning in to your podcast, and I hope all of our viewers and listeners will do that as well. And yeah, thank you for your time. Really appreciate this.
Good. Thank you, Will. It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners and watchers, this is Faithful Politics. And remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.